When Hollywood legend Sylvester Stallone walked into the set of Good Morning America, no one expected that what should have been a routine promotional interview would devolve into one of the most explosive confrontations in live television history. Dressed in his iconic black leather jacket, Stallone exuded his signature blend of grit and confidence. At 77, he still carried the aura of a man who'd weathered every storm Hollywood had thrown his way. His publicist had briefed him thoroughly. Expect light questions. Perhaps some friendly banter about his latest film, a few nostalgic nods to Rocky and Rambo. But George Stephanopoulos had other plans. Behind the scenes, George had spent the previous evening digging deep. Old clips, past interviews, polarizing comments. Nothing was off limits. For reasons known only to him, he seemed to approach this interview not as a conversation, but as a confrontation. As the theme music faded and the cameras began rolling, George wore the practiced smile of a man used to television, but the glint in his eyes told a different story. "We're joined today by the legendary Sylvester Stallone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Thanks for being here." "Always a pleasure," Stallone replied, settling into the chair, unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. The studio lights were warm, the audience relaxed, but then George leaned in. "Before we dive into your latest movie, there's something pressing I want to bring up," he said. "You've made some strong political statements over the years. Some of our viewers are asking, should Hollywood stars use their platforms to influence political discourse?" The air shifted. A hushed tension swept across the set. Stallone didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. He hadn't come here for this. "Well, George," he began, voice calm but with a slight edge, "last time I checked, this was still America. Everyone, actors, journalists, and even former political operatives turned talk show hosts, has the right to speak their mind." The jab about George's political past wasn't missed. The smile on George's face faltered for a heartbeat before he regrouped. "But don't you think fame comes with responsibility? When you speak, millions listen. Shouldn't you be more careful with your message?" Stallone shifted, irritation creeping into his tone. "Careful about what?" "About loving my country, about speaking from the heart. I've spent 50 years being who I am, never pretending otherwise. If that bothers some people, that's on them." The control room buzzed. Camera operators glanced at one another. This was supposed to be about entertainment, not ideology. Yet George pressed on, invoking the tired mantra, "With great power comes great responsibility." "Did you just quote Spider-Man at me?" Stallone asked, incredulous. "George, I came here to talk movies, not to get lectured by someone who used to spin stories for politicians." Now it was personal. George's grip on the conversation slipped as Stallone began to dominate the moment. "Think before I speak. I've been thinking for 70 years. I've built characters that inspired generations. What gives you the right to tell me how to use my voice?" Viewers at home could feel the heat through their screens. Some audience members began to shift uncomfortably. Others pulled out phones, sensing a viral moment in the making. George attempted to retreat. "I'm not attacking you, Sly. I'm just raising concerns." "Concerns from who?" "Twitter trolls, bloggers, political analysts who flip-flop for ratings. You want a real conversation? Let's talk about why you turned this interview into a political ambush." That word ambush cracked the air like a whip. It was no longer about questions. It was about power. George, flushed and faltering, leaned on the one weapon left. "Condescension. That's called journalism," he sneered. "Something you might not understand given your background in hitting people on screen." The insult landed like a sucker punch. Not just to Stallone, but to every fan who'd ever drawn strength from Rocky or Rambo. And Stallone wasn't about to let that slide. "At least my punches are fiction," he said coldly. "You told stories in Washington, and sold them as truth. Who really misled people?" "George." Silence. Not even the hum of the studio lights could break it. Stallone's words were like a mirror, forcing George to look at himself in a way he clearly hadn't intended. "You're being disrespectful to our audience," George muttered, his voice weaker now. "You invited me under false pretenses." Stallone fired back. "Is that how you think journalism works? Ambush a guest, and trap them in your studio just so you can score a headline." The executive producer stood in the control room, motioning to the floor crew. A decision loomed: cut to commercial, or let the fire burn. And then, George made it worse. "Your biggest contribution is movies about violence. My political work actually mattered." The contempt in his tone was unmistakable. Stallone's voice dropped to a whisper, rich with fury. "You think Rocky was about violence? That film was about heart. About a man with one shot to prove he mattered. It gave people hope. Something your spin campaigns never did." George reeled, but Stallone wasn't finished. "What did your work inspire?" "George, better lies, more confusion." Trying to salvage what he could, George waved his hand. "Let's not make this personal." "You made it personal," Stallone growled. "You insulted my life's work, my values, and now you want to hide behind professionalism." The balance had shifted completely. George looked cornered, his authority drained, and then Stallone stood. His rise from the chair was deliberate, powerful. The studio crew stepped back. George, still seated, appeared dwarfed in comparison. "Sit down, Sly," he said, desperation in his voice. "We're done here." And with that, Stallone turned to leave. But George made a final fatal mistake. He reached out, grabbed Stallone's arm. Stallone turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Take your hand off me," he said, voice like steel. George didn't. With a slight motion, Stallone pulled free. No force, no theatrics, just unflinching resolve. "Security," he called out, his voice echoing. And the studio erupted. Security responded immediately, emerging from the wings like an alert battalion, their steps brisk but measured. The entire studio was a live wire, now energy coiled, cameras still rolling, viewers at home still glued to their screens. Stallone, calm but visibly done with the farce, turned to the approaching guard with professional composure. "I need an escort," he said. "This interview is over. And this man," he gestured toward George, "just physically tried to stop me from leaving." The air snapped with tension as the security guards flanked Stallone, creating a protective barrier between him and the host still seated in his chair. George looked around, bewildered, his pride crumbling under the weight of a confrontation he had so foolishly initiated. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "He can't just leave in the middle of an interview. There's protocol, protocol." The word sounded so absurd, so hollow. After what had just unfolded, that one of the boom operators actually chuckled before catching himself. The lead security guard, tall and steady, addressed Stallone with deference. "Mr. Stallone, is everything all right?" "The problem," Stallone said, locking eyes with George, "is that I agreed to talk about my film, and instead got ambushed by someone trying to score points for his political baggage. Now he's decided physical restraint is how interviews should end." A hush fell over the set as George tried to rise from his seat, but his movements were unsure, as though he were only now grasping the consequences of his actions. The executive producer, a seasoned veteran who had witnessed decades of broadcasting mishaps, quickly strode over and conferred with the security team. Then, turning to Stallone with grace honed from years of crisis management, she said, "Mr. Stallone, I deeply apologize for the way this has gone. If you would like to leave, we'll assist you immediately." "That's exactly what I'd like," he replied without hesitation. "And I think your viewers deserve better than a morning host who thinks ambush journalism and physical intimidation are acceptable ways to treat a guest." The comment didn't come off as grandstanding. It sounded like truth. Cold, measured, undebatable. As he moved toward the studio exit, a few crew members gave him subtle nods of respect. George, floundering, made one last grasp at the narrative. "This is exactly what I meant," he shouted. "You can't handle real questions, so you walk out like a coward." Stallone stopped. He turned with a slow, deliberate grace that was somehow more menacing than any outburst could have been. Looking back at George with a stare that could wither steel, he replied, "A coward, George. You know what takes courage? Creating characters that give people hope when they have none. Standing for something even when the world laughs at you for it. Taking hit after hit and still standing. You know what doesn't take courage? Hiding behind a desk and a microphone while taking cheap shots at someone who actually built something. What you did here today wasn't journalism, it was petty, insecure, showboating." Then Stallone turned to face the main camera directly, his voice low but clear. "And if any of you at home are wondering who the real coward is, it's the man, still sitting in that chair, hiding behind a teleprompter, attacking a guest who showed up in good faith and got blindsided instead." The moment was cinematic. The studio froze. The viewers saw it live, unscripted, visceral. George looked smaller than ever, still seated, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his brow. No clever retort left. No teleprompter witty enough to save him. Then came the final blow. Stallone removed the microphone clipped to his jacket, not with a flourish but with slow, deliberate care. He placed it gently on the table between them, the soft thud echoing like a mic drop. "You want to finish your interview," he said. "Finish it by yourself. Talk to the camera. Maybe someone out there still believes this is news." He turned away again, this time not stopping. But just as he reached the edge of the stage, George, either unwilling to give up or too humiliated to let it end on those terms, made one last desperate attempt. He stood and shouted, "We had a contract. You agreed to sit for the whole segment." Stallone stopped again, this time not turning. He looked ahead and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "You violated that contract the second you turned this into a political ambush. A contract isn't just paper, it's trust, and you broke it." And then he walked off. Security followed him. The audience, stunned silent just moments ago, now erupted into scattered applause. Not loud, not theatrical, just enough to tell Stallone that he wasn't walking out alone. George stood frozen, a man who had tried to turn a morning segment into a career-reviving power play and ended up revealing every insecurity he had on national television. The executive producer approached him slowly, holding back visible frustration. "We're cutting to commercial," she whispered, and without waiting for a reply, signaled to the booth. The screen went black, but for those few seconds, before the transition to ADS, the world saw George Stephanopoulos, host, former political strategist, self-proclaimed journalist, standing in the ruins of his own ambush, facing a crowd that now viewed him not as a questioner of power, but as an abuser of it. In the days that followed, clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with takes, commentary, and edits. Stallone's defenders lauded his composure, calling it a masterclass in selflessness. George's critics painted him as everything wrong with modern journalism, arrogant, out of touch. The network scrambled. Statements were issued. "We regret the tone of the interview," read one. George didn't return to the show the next morning, or the next. As for Stallone, he went on with his press tour, quietly, gracefully. Without commenting publicly, he didn't need to. The video spoke louder than any press release ever could, and when his film finally premiered, it shattered opening weekend expectations. Not because of the controversy, but because people wanted to support someone who stood his ground, who reminded the world that dignity isn't given on camera. It's earned when the cameras try to take it away, and you refuse to let them. In the end, the interview that was supposed to question Sylvester Stallone's relevance only cemented his legacy. He didn't just walk out of that studio a star. He walked out a symbol of honor, of resilience, of how to deal with a trap when you're brave enough to flip the script and walk through the fire with your head high. What George tried to weaponize became Stallone's finest moment, and what was supposed to be a routine promotional morning became a legend.